It was the evening of December 24th, an evening I'd been looking forward to for weeks with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. This year, we had decided to celebrate Christmas at my in-laws' home in the Paris suburbs. My name is Amélie, I'm 32 and I've been married to François for 5 years. Our relationship has always been complicated, especially because of his family, but I could never have imagined what was going to happen that evening. From the moment we arrived, the atmosphere was charged with palpable tension. My mother-in-law, Giselle, greeted us with her usual forced smile, while my father-in-law, Pierre, contented himself with a distant nod. Their other children, Marc and Sophie, were already there with their respective spouses, forming a family tableau that looked perfect from the outside. The house was beautifully decorated. A huge fir tree towered in the living room, its branches bending under the weight of glittering baubles and golden tinsel. The smell of cinnamon and gingerbread wafted through the air, mingling with the scent of mulled wine simmering in the kitchen. Everything seemed so normal, so festive, that I almost managed to convince myself that this evening would be different from the previous ones. "Amélie, my darling, come and help me in the kitchen," Giselle said in a honeyed tone that didn't bode well. I glanced at François, hoping for support that never came. He just shrugged his shoulders and headed for the bar to pour himself a drink. In the kitchen, Giselle was bustling around the turkey, checking its doneness for the umpteenth time. "You know, Amélie," she began without looking at me, "a good wife should know how to prepare a proper Christmas meal." I gritted my teeth, swallowing the scathing retort that burned my lips. This was neither the time nor the place for a confrontation. Dinner passed in a strange atmosphere, oscillating between superficial conversations and awkward silences. I could feel Giselle's sidelong glances, her acid comments slipped in between bites of foie gras. François, as usual, remained silent, merely nodding his head at his parents' words. Finally, the long-awaited moment of gift exchange arrived. We all gathered around the tree, eyes shining with anticipation. Marc and Sophie's children were overexcited, tearing open the wrappings with shrieks of joy. I watched the scene with a mixture of tenderness and melancholy, thinking of the child François and I still didn't have. "Amélie, here's your present," Giselle announced, handing me a carefully wrapped box. There was something predatory about her smile that sent shivers down my spine. I took the package, feeling the gaze of the whole family on me. The atmosphere suddenly grew heavy, as if everyone were holding their breath. With trembling fingers, I undid the ribbon and lifted the lid. My heart stopped. Inside, neatly folded, was a black dress with a white apron. A maid's outfit. I looked up in disbelief, searching for an explanation, a sign that this was all a bad joke. But Giselle's face was serious, almost triumphant. "It's time you understood your place in this family, my dear," she said in a sweet voice. "If you really want to be part of our family, this is the role you must accept." I looked around, seeking support, understanding, anything. But all I saw were embarrassed faces and shy looks. François stared at the floor, refusing to meet my gaze. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the ticking of the big clock in the living room. That's when it hit me. This Christmas evening, supposed to be a moment of joy and sharing, had just turned into a waking nightmare. The tension I'd felt earlier was only the prelude to this public humiliation, carefully orchestrated by my mother-in-law. I stood there, frozen, the box in my hands, unable to speak or move. Seconds passed like hours. I could hear the children whispering, not understanding what was happening. Sophie tried a weak marmon, "I don't think that." But Giselle cut her off with a wave of her hand. "It's for your own good, Amélie," Giselle continued, her voice dripping with false concern. "You have to understand that in our family, everyone has a role to play. And yours, well, let's just say it's to be of service to others." I finally found the strength to speak, my voice little more than a whisper. "And if I refuse?" Giselle's smile widened, revealing perfectly white teeth. "Well, in that case, I think we should talk divorce, don't you, François?" My husband finally looked up, his gaze shifting from his mother to me. I saw confusion, shame, but above all cowardice. He wasn't going to defend me. He wasn't going to say anything. Time seemed to stand still. The tree lights flickered softly, creating dancing shadows on the walls. In the distance, I could hear church bells tolling midnight. Christmas had arrived, bringing with it not joy and love, but a cruel revelation of my place in this family. I took one last look at the dress in the box, a symbol of my programmed enslavement. Then, in a slow but determined movement, I closed the box and placed it on the floor. Without a word, I stood up, grabbed my coat and my bag. "Amélie, where are you going?" asked Francois, finally emerging from his torpor. I turned to him, to this whole family that had rejected me since day one. "I'm leaving," I replied simply. "Merry Christmas, everyone." And with those words, I opened the door and stepped out into the cold December night, leaving behind the chaos I'd just caused. Snowflakes fell softly, covering the world in a pure white mantle. I breathed in the icy air, feeling a sense of freedom for the first time in years. I still didn't know where I was going, or what the future held. But one thing was certain, that Christmas night had changed everything. And somewhere deep inside, despite the pain and humiliation, I knew it was for the best. I walked through the snowy streets, the cold biting my cheeks and bare hands. The events of the evening looped in my head, like a nightmare movie I couldn't stop. Giselle's gift of a maid's dress symbolized everything I'd endured since my marriage to Francois. But this time, she'd gone too far. I stopped under a lamppost, watching the snowflakes swirl in the yellow light. The contrast between the peaceful beauty of that Christmas night and the turmoil in my heart was striking. I closed my eyes, reliving the scene once more. Giselle, with her toothy grin, handing me the box. "Amélie, here's your present." His voice was still ringing in my ears, honeyed and threatening at the same time. I should have been suspicious from the start, but my naive hope that it was a genuine gift had blinded me. When I opened the box, the shock was immediate. The black dress, the white apron, everything screamed servitude. I felt all eyes on me, some curious, some embarrassed, but Giselle's was triumphant. "It's time you understood your place in this family, my dear," she had declared, her voice dripping with false benevolence. "If you really want to be part of our family, this is the role you must accept." Those words had hit me like a slap in the face. For years, I'd been trying to fit in, to please, to find my place. And now Giselle was telling me in no uncertain terms what she really wanted from me. Not a daughter-in-law, not a wife for her son, but a servant. The silence that followed was deafening. I looked around for support, but found only blank stares. Mark and Sophie, Francois' brother and sister, looked uncomfortable, but no one dared contradict Giselle. Pierre, my father-in-law, stared at his glass of wine as if it held the secrets of the universe. And Francois, my husband, the man I loved, stood there motionless, his eyes riveted to the ground. His silence spoke louder than any speech. He wouldn't defend me. He wouldn't stand up to his mother. As always, he would choose the path of least resistance. "And if I refuse?" I finally asked, my voice barely audible. Giselle's smile widened, revealing her perfectly white teeth. "Well, in that case, I think we should talk divorce, don't you, Francois?" The ultimatum was set. Accept this degrading role or lose my husband. I could see in Giselle's eyes that she already knew she'd won. She knew the financial dependence she and Francois had kept me in over the years. She knew I'd given up my career to follow Francois in his projects. She thought I had nowhere to go. The seconds ticked by, interminable. I could hear Pierre's heavy breathing, the nervous rustling of Sophie's dress, the confused whispers of the children. Time seemed to stand still in this living room decorated for Christmas, transformed into an arena for this cruel spectacle. It was then that something inside me snapped. Or maybe it woke up. A strength I didn't know I had, a dignity that years of manipulation hadn't completely stifled. I took one last look at the dress in the box. This piece of fabric represented everything I'd endured: Giselle's scathing remarks about my housekeeping, the constant comparisons with real society women, the unrealistic expectations, the incessant criticism. Every Christmas, every family gathering had been an ordeal, but I'd always believed that with time, things would get better. That I would eventually be accepted. But tonight, Giselle had crossed a line. No longer content to belittle me in private, she wanted to humiliate me publicly, to reduce me officially to the rank of servant in her gilded house. In a slow but determined gesture, I closed the box and placed it on the floor. The thud it made as it hit the wooden floor seemed to echo throughout the room. "Amélie," whispered Francois, finally emerging from his torpor. But it was too late. I stood up, grabbed my coat and my bag. The gazes of the whole family followed me, a mixture of surprise, embarrassment and, perhaps, for some, a hint of respect. "I'm leaving," I said simply. "Merry Christmas, everyone." And I walked out the door, leaving behind the chaos I'd just caused. The cold December air hit me in the face, as if waking me from a long nightmare. Now, as I walked through the deserted streets, I fully realized the magnitude of what had just happened. I had said no. For the first time since I'd known this family, I dared to openly oppose Giselle. My phone was vibrating in my pocket. Francois, probably. Or maybe Giselle, furious that her plan had failed. I ignored her. I wasn't ready to face the consequences of my actions. Not yet. I sat on a bench in a small park, watching the Christmas decorations twinkling in the night. Giselle's words still echoed in my head, "If you really want to be part of our family." But did I really want to be part of a family that treated me like this? Who considered me inferior, an object to be molded according to their desires? Divorce. Giselle had brandished it as a threat, but at that moment, sitting in the cold of that Christmas night, I wondered if it wouldn't be a liberation. The end of years of manipulation, of criticism, of vain attempts to please people who would never truly accept me. But the fear was there, lurking in the corner of my mind. What would become of me? Where would I go? I'd given up so much for this marriage, for this family that had never really welcomed me. I thought back to the young woman I had been before I met Francois. Ambitious, independent, full of dreams. Where had she gone? Had she completely faded away under Giselle's blows and Francois' passivity? No, I thought. It was always there, somewhere. And tonight, for the first time in a long time, she had resurfaced. She'd said no. The distant sound of church bells reminded me that it was Christmas. A night supposed to be filled with love, sharing, and joy. And here I was, alone on a bench, with nowhere to go. But strangely, despite the cold, despite the uncertainty, I felt lighter than I had in years. I may have lost a family tonight, but I had regained something far more precious, my dignity. The road ahead would be difficult, I knew. But for the first time in a long time, I felt in control of my life. Giselle would no longer decide my fate. Francois could no longer hide behind his complicit silence. I looked up at the starry sky, letting the snowflakes melt on my face. This Christmas night marked the end of an era, but also the beginning of a new one. And despite the fear, despite the uncertainty, I felt ready to face it. I got up from the bench, feeling the cold that had numbed my limbs during my long reflection. It was time to get moving, to find a place to spend the night. But where to go? I'd never realized how dependent I'd become on Francois and his family until that very moment. My footsteps led me almost instinctively towards the town center. The usually bustling streets were almost deserted on this Christmas night. Only a few late-night revelers and families emerging from midnight mass broke the silence of the sleeping city. I walked aimlessly, letting my thoughts wander. Every illuminated shop window, every twinkling garland reminded me of the disastrous evening I'd just had. How could a night that was supposed to be filled with joy and love have gone so wrong? Rounding a bend in the road, I came upon a small park I'd never noticed before. A sign read Jardin des Reflections. What an appropriate name for my current situation, I thought with a bitter smile. I pushed open the gate and entered. The park was magnificent, even in the middle of winter. Lanterns scattered along the paths created a magical atmosphere, their soft light reflecting off the freshly fallen snow. In the center, a small fountain continued to murmur softly, defying the frost. I sat on a bench facing the fountain, savoring the calm that reigned here. For the first time since leaving my in-laws' house, I allowed myself to breathe deeply, to let my emotions rise to the surface. Anger was the first to surface. Anger at Giselle and her humiliating gift. Anger at Francois and his complicit silence. Anger at myself for having put up with this situation for so long. How could I have come to this? I whispered, my voice fading into the night. I remembered my first meeting with Francois, 7 years ago. I was then a promising young architect, full of ambition and dreams. Francois seduced me with his charm, his intelligence, and his vision of the world. He spoke of grand projects, of travel, of a life full of adventure. Our first months together had been idyllic. Then came the meeting with her family. Right from the start, I sensed that Giselle didn't approve of me. Too simple, not refined enough for her precious son. But I was in love, and I was determined to prove her wrong. The following years had been a long process of erosion. Little by little, I had given up my professional ambitions to conform to Giselle's idea of a good wife. I'd changed the way I dressed, the way I spoke, even the way I thought, in the vain hope of winning her approval. And Francois? He remained a spectator of this slow effacement, never really taking a stand. "You know how my mother is," he would often say to excuse his behavior. "She'll get over it in time." But time hadn't helped. On the contrary, Giselle had become more and more demanding, more and more critical. Every family dinner had become a test, every party an opportunity to subtly belittle me. And tonight, she'd crossed the line. That maid's dress. I shivered just thinking about it. It wasn't just an inappropriate gift, it was a statement. A way of telling me clearly what my place was in their family. Sadness followed anger. Sadness for the hopeful young woman I had been and had lost along the way. Sadness for those wasted years trying to please people who would never truly accept me. But in the midst of this sadness, a small flame of determination began to burn. Wasn't this the opportunity I'd been waiting for without knowing it? The opportunity to get on with my life, to become again the woman I was meant to be. I pulled my phone out of my pocket. 15 missed calls from Francois, 5 from Sophie, his sister. Even 1 from Pierre, my father-in-law, which was a first. But none from Giselle, of course. She must have been furious that her plan had failed. I hesitated for a moment, my finger hovering over Francois' name. What would I say to him if he picked up? Did I want to hear his excuses, his justifications? No, I decided. Not now, I decided. I needed time to think, to take stock of my life and what I really wanted. Instead, I called Marie, my best friend. The one I'd somewhat neglected in recent years, absorbed as I was in my married life and my efforts to please my in-laws. "Amélie." Her sleepy voice answered me after several rings. "Are you all right?" "Marie, I need help," I managed to articulate before the tears began to flow. For the next few minutes, I unpacked everything. The Christmas dinner, Giselle's gift, the ultimatum, my escape. Marie listened in silence, interrupting me only to ask for clarification. "Oh, Amélie," she finally said when I finished my tale. "I'm so sorry. You should have told me sooner." "I know," I replied, wiping away my tears. "I was ashamed, I guess. I didn't want to admit how bad things were." "You can come to my place," she offered without hesitation. "I have a guest room. You can stay as long as you need." Her generosity warmed my heart. "Thank you, Marie. But I think I need to be alone tonight. To think things through." "I understand," she said softly. "But promise me you'll call me if you need anything." "Anytime, okay?" "Promise," I replied, grateful to have such a loyal friend. After hanging up, I felt a little less alone. Knowing I had someone I could count on, someone who wouldn't judge me, was comforting. I looked up at the sky. The clouds had dissipated, revealing a starry sky of breathtaking beauty. How many times had I taken the time to admire the stars in recent years? How many simple little joys had I neglected, too busy trying to conform to other people's expectations? This night of reflection had opened my eyes to many things. The toxicity of my relationship with Francois and his family. About how I'd lost myself in trying to become someone else. But also about my own strength, which I was rediscovering. Dawn was breaking on the horizon, tinting the sky pink and gold. A new day was dawning, symbolic of a new beginning. I still didn't know exactly what the future held in store for me. Would I return to Francois, demanding drastic changes in our relationship? Or would I make a fresh start, alone but free? Those decisions would have to wait. For now, I needed to rest. I got up from the bench, stretched, and took a deep breath of the fresh morning air. For the first time in a long time, I felt at peace with myself. Whatever the future held, I was ready to face it. As I left the Jardin des Reflections, I took one last look at the fountain. The tireless flow of water reminded me that life goes on, that it always finds its way, even in the most difficult of times. I crossed the park gate, ready to face this new day, this new chapter in my life. The night of reflection was over. It was time to act. The sun was rising over Paris as I left the Jardin des Reflections. The streets were beginning to come alive, with the first Christmas workers hurrying to their places of work. I walked with a determined step, my night of reflection having given me a new determination. I decided to return to the apartment I shared with Francois. I knew a confrontation was inevitable, and I preferred to confront him on my own turf, in a place where I felt more in control. Arriving in front of our building, I hesitated for a moment before inserting the key into the lock. My heart was racing. What would I find on the other side of that door? Would Francois be there? Would I have the strength to stand up to him? I took a deep breath and went inside. The apartment was silent, but there were clear signs that Francois had been there. His coat was carelessly discarded on the sofa, his shoes strewn about the hallway. On the living room coffee table, a half-empty bottle of whiskey testified to a restless night. "Francois?" I called softly. A muffled growl reached me from the bedroom. I made my way into the room, my apprehension growing with every step. Francois was there, slumped on the bed, still dressed in his clothes from the night before. He looked up at me with eyes reddened by alcohol and lack of sleep. "Amélie," he whispered, his voice hoarse and tired. "You're back." "Yes," I replied simply, standing in the doorway. "We need to talk." He straightened painfully, running a hand through his messy hair. "I'm sorry about last night. My mother, she went too far. I shouldn't have let this happen." I felt anger rise in me. An apology. Was that all he could think of to say after what had happened? "You shouldn't have let it happen?" I repeated, incredulous. "Francois, your mother gave me a maid's outfit as a Christmas present. She threatened me with divorce if I didn't accept it. And you just stood there, saying nothing, doing nothing." He lowered his eyes, unable to hold my gaze. I know. I should have stepped in. But you know my mother, she can be so manipulative, cruel, tyrannical." I added. "Yes, I know her, Francois. I've put up with her for years. The real question is, why do you let her?" A heavy silence fell between us. Francois seemed to be searching for words, uncomfortable with this direct confrontation. "It's not that simple," he finally said. "This is my family, Amélie. We can't just..." "Can't what?" "Cut in. Can't we demand respect? Can't you defend your wife when she's publicly humiliated? Can't you be an adult and make your own decisions?" My words seemed to hit him like so many slaps. He flinched, but didn't respond. "Francois," I resumed, softening my voice slightly, "I love you. At least, I love the man I thought you were when we got married. But that man would have had the courage to stand up to his mother last night." He looked up at me, and I saw a gleam of understanding light up there. "What do you mean?" I took a deep breath. This was the moment of truth. "I want to say that things can't go on like this. I can't live like this anymore, Francois. I can no longer be constantly belittled, criticized, humiliated. I can no longer be married to a man who won't stand up for me." "But what do you want me to do?" he asked, a hint of panic in his voice. "I want you to choose," I replied firmly. "Your mother or me. This life of submission to her will, or a life where we make our own decisions." Francois paled. "You can't ask me that, Amélie. They're my family." "What about me, Francois? Aren't I supposed to be your family too?" The silence that followed was deafening. I saw Francois struggling internally, torn between his love for me and his loyalty to his family. "I need time," he finally said. "To think, to talk to my mother." I shook my head. "No, Francois. I've spent years waiting for things to change. I need a decision now." He looked at me, his eyes wide with surprise and fear. "Now?" "But..." "Yes, now," I insisted. Because if you can't choose, then I will. And I'll choose to leave. Those words seemed to shake him more than anything else. Leave? You mean, divorce? If that's what it takes for me to regain my dignity, then yes. Francois stood up abruptly, staggering slightly. You can't be serious. After all we've been through together. It's precisely because of all we've been through that I'm serious, I replied. I've sacrificed so much for this marriage, Francois. My career, my ambitions, my self-esteem. And for what? To be treated like a servant by your mother? He took a step toward me, reaching out as if to touch me, but I stepped back. Amélie, please. We can work things out. I'll talk to my mother. I'll tell her. No, I cut him off. It's not your mother you need to talk to. It's me. Tell me you're ready to cut ties with her if necessary. Tell me you'll choose me over her tyranny. Francois opened his mouth, then closed it again. I saw the struggle in his eyes, the conflict between his desire to keep me and his fear of opposing his mother. I can't, he finally whispered. I can't choose like that. Those words, though predictable, hit me like a punch. Despite everything, part of me had hoped that he would choose our love. But the reality was there, brutal and undeniable. So it's up to me, I said, my voice trembling despite my efforts to remain calm. I'm leaving, Francois. I can't live like this anymore. He looked at me, his eyes wide with panic. No, wait. We can discuss it, find a solution. But I had already started gathering my things, throwing some clothes into a suitcase. Francois followed me, continuing to plead, promising that things would change. But I stopped listening. My mind was made up. In less than an hour, I had gathered most of my belongings. Francois stood in the doorway, looking lost and distraught. Please, Amélie, he tried one last time. Don't. I put my hand on the doorknob, then turned back to him. I loved you, Francois. Part of me will always love you. But I love myself more. And I deserve better. With those words, I opened the door and walked out, leaving behind my marriage, my years of submission, and the man who hadn't had the courage to choose me. In the elevator, I felt tears rolling down my cheeks. But for the first time in a long time, they weren't tears of sadness or frustration. They were tears of relief, of liberation. As I left the building, I took a deep breath. The fresh morning air seemed more invigorating than ever. A new life awaited me, full of uncertainties but also of possibilities. I pulled out my phone and called Marie. It's done, I said when she picked up. I've left Francois. Oh, Amélie, she replied, her voice full of compassion. Do you want me to pick you up? Yes, please, I replied, suddenly feeling the full weight of the fatigue and emotions of the last 24 hours. I'll be right there, she said. Hang in there, sweetheart. You made the right choice. As I hung up, I realized she was right. Despite the pain, despite the fear of the unknown, deep down I knew I'd made the right choice. The confrontation was over, and I had emerged stronger than ever. The weeks that followed my departure from Francois' apartment were a whirlwind of emotions and changes. I temporarily moved in with Marie, my faithful friend, who offered me not only a roof over my head, but also invaluable support during this tumultuous period. The first few days were the most difficult. I sometimes woke up in the middle of the night, disoriented, looking for Francois by my side before remembering that everything had changed. The reality of my decision hit me hard, a mixture of relief and fear of the unknown. Francois tried to contact me several times. His messages oscillated between pleas and promises of change. I'll talk to my mother, things will be different, please come back. But each time, I could feel the lack of conviction behind his words. He still hadn't understood that the problem wasn't just his mother, but also his inability to take a stand, to defend me, to be the man I needed. As for Giselle, she went through different phases. First denial, then anger. She even tried to contact me directly, alternating between accusations of breaking up her family and clumsy attempts at reconciliation. I ended up blocking her number, realizing that these interactions were only taking me backwards. It was on one particularly difficult evening, while crying on Marie's shoulder, that I made a decision that would change the course of my life. You know, Marie said, handing me a handkerchief, You've always been passionate about architecture. Why not pick up where you left off? His words resonated within me like a distant echo of my forgotten dreams. Architecture. My passion, my ambition, everything I'd put aside to please Francois and his family. The next morning, I began my research. I discovered that a local university was offering a refresher program for professionals wishing to return to their architectural studies. It was as if the universe was sending me a sign. Signing up wasn't easy. I had to go through interviews, prove that despite years of inactivity, my passion and skills were still there. But every step of the way reminded me why I loved this field so much. The day I received the acceptance letter was a turning point. For the first time since my marriage, I felt like I was taking back control of my life. I cried, but this time they were tears of joy and hope. Alongside my studies, I started therapy. The sessions helped me understand how I had come to lose so much of myself in my marriage. I learned to recognize the signs of a toxic relationship, to set healthy boundaries and, above all, to value myself. Months went by, and I immersed myself body and soul in my studies. Every new concept I learned, every project I completed was like a stone in the rebuilding of my self-esteem. I rediscovered the woman I had been before Francois, only better, stronger, wiser, more resilient. One day, while working on a sustainable urban planning project, I had an epiphany. I didn't just want to design buildings, I wanted to create spaces that would have a positive impact on people's lives. Places that would foster mutual aid, community, and personal fulfillment. This idea became my driving force, my new mission. It was during this period that I met Lucas, a visiting professor specializing in ecological architecture. Our impassioned discussions on the future of urban planning quickly evolved into a deep friendship. Unlike Francois, Lucas encouraged my ambitions and valued my ideas. For the first time in a long time, I felt truly listened to and understood. One evening, while we were working late on a project, Lucas looked at me with an intensity that sent shivers down my spine. "You know, Amélie," he said softly, "you're an extraordinary woman. The way you've taken back your life, your passion for what you do, it's inspiring." I felt my cheeks flush. "Thank you, Lucas. It means a lot to me." He hesitated a moment, then added, "I was wondering if, maybe, you'd agree to have dinner with me one night? Not to work, just to be together." My heart raced. Part of me was terrified of opening up again, of risking being hurt. But another, stronger part urged me to take the chance. "I'd love to," I replied with a smile. Our first date was magical. We talked for hours, about our dreams, our fears, our hopes for the future. With Lucas, I didn't need to censor myself or pretend to be someone else. I could be myself, fully and without reserve. Our relationship evolved slowly, naturally. Lucas respected my need for independence and understood my hesitations linked to my past. He didn't try to change or control me, but encouraged me to blossom. A year after I left Francois, I received the divorce papers. As I signed them, I felt a mixture of sadness and relief. It was the official end of a chapter in my life, but also the beginning of a new one. That evening, Lucas took me out to dinner to celebrate. Not the divorce per se, but my newfound freedom, my fresh start. "To you, Amélie," he said, raising his glass. "To your strength, your courage, and whatever the future holds for you." I smiled, moved by the sincerity of his words. "To us," I replied. "To this life we're building, day by day." A few months later, I graduated with honors. My thesis on architecture as a tool for social transformation was praised by the jury and even earned me a job offer with a renowned firm. On graduation day, as I stood on the podium with my diploma in hand, I swept my eyes over the crowd. Marie was there, applauding wildly. Lucas, in the front row, looked at me with pride and love. And somewhere at the back of the room, I caught a glimpse of a familiar silhouette. Francois. Our eyes met for a brief moment. In his eyes, I read regret, perhaps even admiration. I simply nodded in his direction, without animosity. This gesture was my way of turning the page for good, to show him that I'd moved on, that I was happy. As I stepped down from the stage, I made my way towards Lucas and Marie. Lucas took me in his arms, making me whirl with joy. "You did it, my love," he whispered in my ear. "I'm so proud of you." Marie joined us, tears in her eyes. "My little Amelie," she said, hugging me. "Look how far you've come." Indeed, how far I've come. From that terrible Christmas night when I had fled my in-laws' house, humiliated and broken, to that day of triumph when I held my future in my hands. The contrast was striking. That evening, as we celebrated with our friends, I took a moment to reflect on all that had happened. Giselle's gift, which at the time had seemed like the worst thing that could happen to me, had in fact turned out to be a catalyst. It pushed me to make the most difficult yet liberating decision of my life. I realized that sometimes, what seems to be our greatest misfortune can actually be the beginning of our greatest happiness. All it takes is the courage to take the first step, to believe in yourself and to never give up on your dreams. Today, as I work on projects I'm passionate about, alongside a man who supports me and loves me for who I am, I can't help but smile. Life has given me a surprising turn, yes, but such a wonderful one. And who knows what the future will bring? One thing's for sure, I'm ready to face it, stronger and more determined than ever.